What would you do if the very thing you mocked turned out to be the only thing that could save the person you love most? Have you ever witnessed someone so blinded by pride that they couldn't see the value of what was right in front of them? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you more than you think. It all began in a lavish home just outside New York City, where every corner gleamed with wealth and power. John, a successful businessman who had built his empire from the ground up, believed that money was the answer to every problem. To him, nothing else mattered. Not tradition, not humility, and certainly not faith. But one evening, as he walked through his perfectly decorated living room, he caught sight of something that ignited his fury. His maid, Mary, a quiet woman from a modest background, was standing in the corner, whispering a prayer. John's voice thundered through the room. "Not in my house." His words weren't just loud, they carried the arrogance of a man convinced that his rules, his authority, and his money could silence anything he didn't understand. Mary froze, clutching her hands tighter, her lips trembling as she lowered her gaze. She didn't argue. She simply nodded and stepped back, her humility meeting his harshness like a soft breeze against a storm. But inside, she whispered a silent promise to herself. She would continue to pray, even if only in secret. Now, ask yourself this. How often do we underestimate the quiet strength of others? How often do we dismiss what we cannot measure just because it doesn't fit into our world of control? John didn't realize it yet, but the very thing he rejected in anger was the one force he would soon beg for. Mary wasn't just a maid. She was a woman who had faced struggles far greater than John could imagine. Nights of hunger, mornings of uncertainty, and endless days where faith was her only anchor. While John's wealth insulated him from life's storms, Mary had learned to weather them with nothing but prayer and perseverance. And yet, in his grand mansion, she was treated as invisible, her devotion brushed aside as nothing more than superstition. But life has a way of humbling even the proudest among us. And in John's house, the cracks of arrogance were about to break wide open. His daughter Emily, the apple of his eye, was full of laughter and light. She was the one part of his life that softened his edges, the child he adored more than all the riches he had gathered. Yet even Emily's joy couldn't shield the family from what was coming. One night, Emily fell ill, suddenly, violently, and with a force that even the best doctors couldn't fully explain. Panic swept through the household as her breathing grew shallow and her face paled. John, a man used to commanding boardrooms and signing million-dollar deals, found himself helpless, staring at his little girl with fear clawing at his chest. Money couldn't fix it. Power couldn't fix it. And for the first time, John's voice broke, stripped of all arrogance as he whispered, "What do I do?" And it was then, in the shadow of despair, that Mary stepped forward again. The same woman he had silenced for daring to pray in his living room. The same woman he had humiliated with his rage. She didn't speak of her pain or remind him of his cruelty. Instead, she did what she always did. She lowered her head, closed her eyes, and began to pray. What happened next is something John could never have imagined. But before we reach that moment, before we uncover how a simple prayer would shake the walls of arrogance and rewrite the fate of a family, let's return to the beginning of this extraordinary night. And maybe this is the moment to pause and reflect together, because what we've seen so far isn't just a story about a wealthy man and his maid. It's about something deeper. It's about pride, humility, and those quiet forces we often ignore until life brings us to our knees. Have you ever been through something like that? A moment when the very thing you dismissed turned out to be what you needed most? If this thought touches you in any way, I'd love to hear your voice in the comments. Share your feelings, your experiences, even just a word that captures how this story resonates with you. Your words don't just stay on the screen. They create a community. They remind others watching that they're not alone, that these themes of faith, love, and redemption are alive in many. lives, not just in stories like this. And every time you take a second to leave a comment or even tap that like button, it tells me this content matters to you. It helps the channel keep growing, reaching more people who might need this exact reminder in their own struggles. And if you're the kind of person who wants to keep walking with me through stories that dig deeper into the heart, stories that mix emotion, contrast, and lessons that stay with you, then subscribing is the best way to stay connected. Think of it as joining a circle where every video adds one more thread to this fabric of human experience we're weaving together. So if something here has stirred something inside you, take that step, comment, like, and subscribe, because it's your participation that gives these stories life far beyond the screen. Now, let's go back to that night in John's house, where the quiet voice he once silenced was about to become the loudest force of all. John Peterson was the kind of man whose name carried weight in the business world. Born and raised in Manhattan, he had built his fortune through real estate deals that most people would never even understand. His reputation was polished like the marble floors in his penthouse, his words sharp as the suits tailored perfectly to his frame. To those who met him, John represented power, power that didn't bend, didn't apologize, and certainly didn't believe in anything it couldn't measure on a profit chart. He often said, half joking, but fully believing, money solves everything. If it doesn't, you just don't have enough of it. That mindset had followed him like a shadow, shaping his decisions, his friendships, even the way he raised his daughter. And yet, behind the carefully built image of success, there was an emptiness that John refused to acknowledge. He drowned it with meetings, with expensive dinners, with constant phone calls that proved how indispensable he was. Faith? That was for people without plans. Prayer? That was for people without power. He scoffed at both, refusing to admit that a part of him had once been curious about what lay beyond the reach of his own control. But years of ambition had hardened him, leaving no space for anything that didn't serve his empire. In the same city, but in a completely different world, lived Mary Collins. She was in her late 30s, her hands marked by years of labor, her smile gentle yet tired from carrying more burdens than most would notice. Mary worked for John as his live-in maid, tending to the enormous house in Westchester County that looked more like a museum than a home. She cleaned rooms she would never sleep in, polished silverware she would never use, and prepared meals she could only dream of sharing with her own children. Yet despite the weight of her reality, Mary carried something far more valuable than wealth: faith. It wasn't loud or demanding, it was quiet, steady, the kind of faith that doesn't waver even when storms rage. She prayed every morning before starting her tasks, whispered blessings over the meals she cooked, and carried in her heart the hope that God was listening, even when life was unkind. To her, prayer wasn't just ritual, it was survival, the anchor that kept her grounded when everything else threatened to drift away. John noticed her devotion, of course. It irritated him. The sight of Mary folding her hands or whispering softly when she thought no one was watching felt like a thorn in his carefully curated environment. He dismissed it as superstition, something beneath the logic of a man who had everything under control. "You really think those whispers are going to change anything?" he once sneered, catching her in the kitchen with her eyes closed. Mary didn't answer, but her silence wasn't weakness. It was a quiet strength that John couldn't comprehend, a refusal to let go of what she believed in, no matter how much he mocked her. The clash between their worlds was unavoidable. John, armored in pride and convinced of his self-sufficiency. Mary, grounded in humility and faith, certain that life's hidden truths couldn't be bought or silenced. It was a contrast as sharp as light against darkness, wealth against need, arrogance against grace. And while John thought he was the one holding all the power, the reality was far more complicated. Because deep down, beneath his polished surface, John was a man afraid of vulnerability. He had built his empire not only to gain wealth, but to shield himself from pain. Losing his wife years earlier to an illness he couldn't control had carved a scar so deep he never allowed himself to face it. Instead, he buried the grief under layers of work and status, convincing himself that dependence on people, on faith, on anything, was weakness. That hidden truth shaped every decision he made, and it was why he couldn't stand seeing Mary's quiet reliance on something he had rejected long ago. Mary, on the other hand, carried her struggles. Openly, she had no mansion to hide them in, no boardroom victories to mask her scars. Life had been harsh, raising 2 children alone after her husband left, working endless shifts to pay bills that never seemed to end. But rather than letting bitterness consume her, she turned to prayer. She believed that transformation began not with wealth, but with faith, not with control, but with surrender. For her, every whispered prayer was a decision to choose hope over despair, strength over defeat. Their interactions were often tense. John gave orders, Mary obeyed. He expected perfection, she delivered it with quiet dignity. But behind the scenes, something unspoken lingered. Emily, John's daughter, adored Mary. To the young girl, Mary wasn't just the maid. She was a gentle presence, someone who listened, someone who cared without judgment. When Emily felt her father's cold distance, it was Mary who filled the silence with kindness. And though John noticed the bond, he never acknowledged it, brushing it off as a child's attachment to a caregiver. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, John returned home, exhausted. He walked into the living room and stopped in his tracks. There was Mary again, standing in the corner, her head bowed, lips moving in prayer. The sight struck him like an insult. He had told her before, this was his house, his rules. He marched toward her, his voice booming. "Mary, I told you once, and I'll tell you again, no praying in my house. Do you hear me? Not in my house." Mary looked up slowly, her eyes calm despite the storm in his voice. "Mr. Peterson, I meant no disrespect. I was only asking for strength to serve well." John scoffed, throwing his hands up. "Strength comes from discipline, from hard work, from focus, not from—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Forget it. Just do your job." Mary lowered her eyes again, murmuring softly, "Yes, sir." But in her heart, the prayer continued, louder than his anger, stronger than his pride. That night, as John sat alone in his office, sipping whiskey and staring at the city's skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he couldn't shake the image of Mary's steady gaze. Why didn't she flinch? Why didn't she fight back? It puzzled him, disturbed him, even angered him. For all his power, he couldn't control her faith, and that realization gnawed at him more than he wanted to admit. In the quiet of that moment, a subtle shift was already beginning. John didn't know it yet, but life was about to dismantle his certainty piece by piece. His carefully crafted image of invincibility would be tested, his mindset would be challenged, and the impact of his choices would echo far beyond what he could see. And standing right at the center of it all would be Mary, the woman he dismissed as insignificant, yet whose quiet strength would soon reveal a hidden truth he could no longer ignore. It was within those unseen battles between wealth and humility, control and surrender, that the story truly began to unfold. And on that night, in a house that seemed untouchable, the first cracks in John's armor of pride were already forming, waiting for the moment when everything he thought he knew would collapse under the weight of something far greater than himself. The Peterson mansion in Westchester stood like a monument to success, with its sweeping driveway lined by imported maple trees, glass chandeliers glowing in every hallway, and walls decorated with original art pieces. Worth more than most people's homes, it was a palace in all but name. Guests often compared it to the kind of estates you see in magazines, the kind that feels more like a showroom than a place where a family actually lives. John loved that comparison. To him, appearances were everything. When business associates visited, he would casually gesture toward the marble staircase or the rare painting above the fireplace, as if wealth itself were part of his resume. His world was one of cocktail, Parties filled with powerful men in tailored suits, women draped in jewels, and laughter that carried the certainty of never worrying about bills or empty refrigerators. But beyond the bright lights of John's social circle, beyond the carefully groomed gardens and security gates, was Mary's world, a world that couldn't be more different. Mary lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment with her teenage son and her mother. The building was old, the paint chipping from the walls, the pipes making noises at night, but it was home. Every morning, before leaving for the mansion, she packed sandwiches for her son and whispered prayers over him, asking God to guide his steps and protect him from the temptations that often came knocking in their neighborhood. Her evenings were spent stretching paychecks, figuring out which bills could wait another week, and fixing simple meals that somehow still carried the warmth of love. John never thought about those realities. For him, Mary was just an employee, a background figure in the grand theater of his life. He never once considered how she managed her days outside his mansion. When he saw her tired eyes or worn-out shoes, he dismissed them as lack of discipline. "If she worked as hard as I do, she wouldn't live like that," he muttered once to a friend, his voice dripping with arrogance. It was the kind of statement that revealed more about him than about her, exposing the hidden truth of a man who believed wealth equaled worth. The contrast between them could be felt in every interaction. John's mornings began with strong coffee served on a silver tray, while Mary's began with hurried steps to catch the early bus, often praying under her breath that it wouldn't break down. John attended gala dinners, where conversations revolved around stocks, politics, and golf, while Mary attended Sunday church services, where the voices of ordinary people rose in hymns of gratitude for simply making it through another week. John's circle. Her friends congratulated themselves on acquisitions and million-dollar deals. Mary's circle encouraged each other to hold on, to believe, to not give up even when life pressed them down. And yet, for all his riches, John's life lacked something Mary carried effortlessly: peace. He had luxury but not rest. He had influence but not joy. His laughter at parties was loud, but it never lingered. Mary, on the other hand, despite her struggles, carried a light that drew people to her. She listened. When others spoke, remembered names, offered words of comfort. Her humility wasn't weakness. It was strength born of years of choosing hope in the face of despair. One evening, during a dinner John hosted for a group of investors, the social contrast couldn't have been clearer. The men at the table spoke in polished tones, laughing at jokes that revolved around who had the bigger yacht or the most exclusive membership at a country club. Waiters flowed in and out with expensive wine, and Mary moved quietly among them, refilling glasses and clearing plates. John leaned back in his chair, satisfied, soaking in the admiration of his guests. He noticed Mary at one point, standing silently in the corner, waiting for the next signal. To him she was invisible, but to his daughter Emily, sitting on the stairs nearby, she was the only person in the room who truly mattered. Mary smiled at Emily as she passed by, a smile that carried comfort and warmth. Emily waved shyly, her eyes lighting up. John caught the exchange and frowned. He didn't like the idea of his daughter being too close to the staff. "Emily, go upstairs," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. The girl hesitated, glancing once more at Mary before obeying. Mary lowered her head, hiding the sadness in her eyes, but she whispered softly to herself, "She just needs love." Behind the scenes of the mansion's glamour, Mary's life was filled with sacrifices no one in that room would ever imagine. She worked double shifts, sent part of her wages to her sister, who was struggling even more than she was, and still found the strength to kneel every night, praying not just for her own family, but even for the Petersons. It was a decision she made daily, to meet arrogance with humility, cruelty with kindness. For John, arrogance was armor. He had decided long ago that to survive in business you needed to dominate, to never show weakness, to never allow others to see your doubts. That mindset seeped into his personal life, shaping the way he treated those around him. "If you want respect, you earn it," he often declared. But in practice, what he demanded wasn't respect, it was submission. To him, authority was measured by how quickly others obeyed, how little they questioned. Mary, in contrast, embodied a different kind of authority. It wasn't loud or forceful, but it carried impact. When she spoke, people listened, not because they feared her, but because they felt her sincerity. Her humility gave her a quiet strength, a presence that could calm a room. And though John dismissed it as servitude, the truth was that Mary's strength lay in her ability to remain kind in a world that gave her every reason not to be. The tension between these two worlds, the mansion's arrogance and the maid's humility, wasn't just a backdrop. It was the core of the journey that was unfolding, a revelation waiting to be exposed. John believed his wealth insulated him from the struggles of people like Mary, but he was about to discover that all the marble and chandeliers in the world couldn't shield him from life's deepest blows. And Mary, though underestimated, carried within her the very strength that would one day break through his pride. That contrast, so vivid and so undeniable, was the stage on which the next chapter of their story would be written. And while John poured another glass of expensive wine, convinced of his untouchable status, and Mary quietly tucked away her pain with a whispered prayer, the forces of their worlds were already colliding in ways neither of them could see. It was late afternoon when the clash finally broke the fragile balance inside the Peterson mansion. The sun was setting behind the wide windows, painting the room in gold, but inside, the atmosphere was anything but serene. John had just returned from a meeting downtown, his temper already short from a deal that hadn't gone his way. He stepped into the living room, loosening his tie, and froze. When he saw Mary standing near the window, her head bowed, lips moving in a whisper. "Not again," he muttered, his jaw tightening as he strode toward her. "Mary," his voice thundered, echoing off the polished walls. "What did I tell you? Not in my house. I don't want this nonsense here." Mary's hands were clasped, but she opened her eyes slowly, meeting his glare with quiet calm. "Mr. Peterson, I wasn't disturbing anyone. I was just—" He cut her off, his voice dripping with disdain. "Your prayers won't pay the bills, Mary. They won't close deals. They won't keep the lights on in this house. Do you understand that? You want strength? Work harder. That's the only thing that matters." For a moment, silence filled the room. Mary lowered her gaze, not because she agreed with him, but because she knew arguing would only harden his anger. "Yes, sir," she said softly, her voice steady even as humiliation burned inside her. John scoffed and turned away, pouring himself a drink at the bar. To him, it was settled. Authority had been asserted. Yet behind that small exchange lay a hidden truth he didn't see. Mary's faith wasn't for show, and it wasn't fragile. Even as he tried to silence her, her prayers continued in the quiet of her heart. She prayed for strength to endure his cruelty, for protection over Emily, and, perhaps most surprising of all, for John himself. This was the collision of two worlds. On one side, John's mindset was built on control and calculation, convinced that success came only through force, decisions, and relentless drive. On the other, Mary's world was woven with threads of humility, patience, and a belief that transformation often begins in the unseen. John couldn't grasp that. He saw her silence as weakness, her faith as foolishness. But the impact of that moment was deeper than either of them realized. As the evening wore on, John invited a few colleagues over for drinks. The men laughed loudly, boasting about their latest wins, mocking those who, in their eyes, lacked ambition. John thrived in that environment. "Discipline and strategy," he said, raising his glass. "That's how you win. Everything else is an excuse." His friends nodded in agreement, feeding his pride. Mary, moving quietly through the room to serve hors d'oeuvres, heard every word. She said nothing, but inside she whispered a silent prayer. "Lord, soften his heart. Show him what power really means." Her humility was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to let his arrogance dictate her spirit. Later that night, after the guests left and the house grew quiet, John walked past Mary in the hallway. He paused, looking at her with a mix of irritation and curiosity. "Tell me something," he said, his tone sharp but edged with genuine wonder. "Why do you keep doing it? Why do you keep praying when it's useless? Look around you. You're struggling, you're tired, and yet you cling to something invisible. Why?" Mary lifted her eyes to him, her voice calm. "Because it's not useless. It's the only reason I can keep going. Prayer doesn't always change what's outside, but it changes what's inside. And sometimes, Mr. Peterson, that's the real battle." John shook his head, dismissing her words with a bitter laugh. "That's exactly the kind of mindset that keeps people down, waiting for miracles instead of making decisions that matter. Don't expect me to respect that." He walked away, leaving her in the dim light of the hallway, but her words lingered in the air, a quiet revelation that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. For Mary, this wasn't just about her. Each time she bowed her head, she carried John's family into her prayers. She asked for Emily's happiness, for the weight on John's heart to be lifted, for peace to enter a house that seemed to worship everything but love. She didn't need recognition. She didn't need him to understand. Her faith wasn't dependent on approval. It was steady, like a current running beneath the surface, shaping the journey even when no one could see it. Behind the scenes, Emily noticed the tension too. She had overheard her father's harsh words earlier, had seen the way Mary accepted them without complaint. That night, when she tiptoed downstairs for a glass of water, she found Mary sitting quietly in the kitchen, her hands folded on the table. "Mary," Emily whispered, "why does Dad get so mad when you pray?" Mary smiled softly, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind the girl's ear. "Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand. Your dad thinks strength comes from power and control, but strength can also come from love and faith. He'll see it one day." Emily tilted her head, her young mind wrestling with the words. "I like when you pray. It makes me feel safe." Mary's heart ached at the child's innocence. She squeezed Emily's hand gently. "That's because prayer carries peace, and peace is something this world can't always give." The girl nodded, holding on to that thought as if it were a secret treasure. Meanwhile, upstairs, John sat in his office, staring at the city skyline, replaying Mary's words in his mind. He would never admit it out loud, but something about her calm defiance unsettled him. He had faced competitors, lawsuits, and financial crises without flinching, yet a maid's quiet faith left him uneasy. He told himself it was nonsense, superstition, a distraction, but beneath his dismissal, a small crack had appeared in his certainty. What John didn't realize was that life has a way of testing even the strongest walls. He believed he was in control, that his wealth and decisions secured his world, but just beyond the horizon of his awareness, events were already stirring. Events that would expose the limits of his arrogance and reveal the hidden strength in the woman he had tried to silence. The mansion remained quiet that night, but within its walls two forces were colliding, one built on pride, the other on faith. And as John poured himself another drink, convinced the matter was settled, Mary whispered another prayer into the stillness, a prayer that carried far more weight than his anger ever could. The journey between them was only beginning, and the impact of these choices would reach further than either of them could yet imagine. Emily Peterson was the soft light in a house that often felt like a museum. At 8 years old, with a constellation of freckles across her nose and a habit of humming to herself when she read, she moved through the mansion with a wonder that even the marble floors couldn't silence. She loved the big bay window in the library where the afternoon sun turned the dust into glitter, and she loved following Mary around the kitchen, asking questions about recipes and life as if both were forms of magic. "Mary, do you think God hears me if I'm not speaking out loud?" she asked once, cheeks flushed from running up the stairs. "He hears you most when you don't," Mary answered, smoothing a wrinkle from Emily's sleeve. It wasn't a sermon, it was a truth offered like a warm blanket. John didn't object to their closeness outright, but lately he'd been more distant, more rigid. The busier he became, the more he arranged his life into columns. Assets and liabilities, wins and losses, noise and order. He loved his daughter fiercely, but his love came packaged in structure. Private tutors, scheduled playdates, a calendar managed to the minute. He believed that was what good fathers did. They made decisions. They funded opportunities. They built a future sturdy enough to withstand uncertainty. But children don't always move by calendars, and life certainly doesn't. The hidden truth was that the strongest love sometimes needs flexibility more than walls, patience more than plans. That truth had no place in John's mindset. It was an off-balance line item, and he didn't know where to file it. One quiet evening in early autumn, the first sign of trouble arrived like a whisper. You can't quite place. Emily's laughter at dinner faded into quiet, and her fork rested untouched at the edge of her plate. Everything okay?" John asked, scanning her face. "I'm a little tired," she said, her voice smaller than usual. "My head hurts." Mary touched Emily's forehead gently and glanced at John. "She feels warm. Maybe we should keep her in tonight and see how she does." John nodded without looking away from his phone. "I'll have Dr. Whitaker check in tomorrow." It sounded reasonable. It also sounded like postponement. That night, Emily woke up shaking. The house, which usually wore its stillness like a crown, changed character. It felt like a stage where the music had stopped and everyone was waiting for the next cue. Mary heard the soft, frightened steps in the hallway and found Emily standing there with tears on her face, breath quick and shallow. "Mary, I don't feel good," she whispered, pressing her hands to her stomach. Mary scooped her up without another word, heart pounding, at the heat radiating through the child's pajamas. "Mr. Peterson," she called, firm and steady, "I think you should come." John arrived, hair tousled, the sharp edges of his composure softened by worry. "What's going on?" he demanded. But the anger wasn't for Mary. It was for the fear he didn't know how to control. "She's burning up. We should call the doctor now." "It's the middle of the night," he muttered, already dialing. "He'll answer for us." Dr. Whitaker's voice came through groggy but professional. He asked questions. He gave instructions. "Cool compresses, fluids, children's ibuprofen. Monitor her breathing. If it changes, call me back immediately." The instructions were practical. They calmed John's hands, but they didn't calm his eyes. He hovered by the bed, repeating, "You're okay, kiddo," as if the words themselves could lower a fever. Emily tried to smile. "Daddy, can you sit with me?" "Of course," he said, settling on the edge of the bed, suit pants creasing at the knees. Hours stretched. The fever did not listen. Mary moved through the room like a quiet current. Fresh compress, sips of water, a hand on Emily's back when the chills came. "You're not alone, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice a small light. Around 3 in the morning, Emily's breathing shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, like a rhythm stumbling on the stairs. Mary recognized it instantly, the way people who've spent their lives caring for others recognize the tiniest changes. "Mr. Peterson," she said softly, "we should call again." John's voice sharpened with urgency. "She's breathing fast. It sounds different." The doctor was already on his way when John hung up. He called a car service, then cancelled it and called for a private ambulance, then cancelled that and called again. Decisions piled up, none of them feeling like enough. Money churned at the edges of the problem, trying to purchase certainty, but certainty refused the transaction. "Why isn't she getting better?" he snapped, pacing the length of the room. The question had no target. It ricocheted off the furniture. "She was fine yesterday." Mary didn't answer. She dipped the cloth in cool water, wrung it gently, and laid it on Emily's forehead. In the hush between movement and worry, she breathed a small, silent prayer. Let peace come. Let wisdom come. Let breath come steady. Emily's eyes fluttered. "Mary, will you stay?" "I'm here," Mary said, and meant it in every way. The doctor arrived with the first grey of mourning, and set his bag on the dresser with the practiced composure of someone used to carrying bad news gently. He examined Emily, checked her oxygen levels, listened to her lungs. "She's fighting something strong," he said finally, looking at John with muscles pulled tight behind his calm. "We need to keep a close watch. If her breathing dips again, we transport." John nodded, every cell in his body straining with the need to fix it. "Do whatever you have to do. I'll pay for it. Whatever it costs." Dr. Whitaker's eyes softened. "This isn't about money, John. It's about time and care. We'll act if we need to." The words landed with a dull thud in a room full of gleaming things. John had always found comfort in transaction and speed. Now the currency was patience, and he didn't have much. He stood there, a giant in every measurable way, feeling smaller by the minute. "Why can't we just buy the right equipment, bring in the best specialist something?" His voice cracked. "Around the edges. We will bring in what helps," the doctor said gently, "but the body has its own journey. Sometimes it chooses the timeline, not us." In the hours that followed, John discovered a corridor of helplessness he had never walked. He had faced down hostile investors, negotiated under pressure, survived market swings that would have sunk lesser men. But none of that translated here, where a child's breath dictated the pace. He held Emily's hand like it was both anchor and plea. "Kiddo, it's Dad. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere," he whispered. And in that whisper lived 1,000 apologies for meetings missed and bedtime stories interrupted by phone calls. Mary noticed none of the expensive objects mattered. The art on the walls didn't comfort a child. The rare rugs didn't lower fevers. The security system couldn't keep illness out. In moments like this, the architecture of pride always revealed its cracks. She kept working in the quiet, an unseen nurse in a house that often pretended it didn't need soft things. She wasn't thinking about philosophy. She was thinking about the next glass of water, the next cool cloth, the next small act that might ease the child's journey through the valley she'd entered. "Breathe with me, Emily," Mary said softly, matching the timing with her own chest. "In and out." Emily obeyed, tiny shoulders lifting, falling, lifting again. Mary's eyes glistened as she whispered, "There you go, sweetheart." By late afternoon, the fever spiked again. The monitors Dr. Whitaker had brought beeped a thin alarm that sliced through the mansion's polished silence. "We're transporting," he said, voice clipped now, professional urgency replacing bedside calm. "I want her at New York Presbyterian. They're ready." John nodded once, a decisive cut of air, and followed the stretcher down the hallway that had never seen such haste. Staff froze, watching a tableau they'd never imagined. The master of the house walking behind a child whose small hand clutched a thread of the sheet like a lifeline. In the ambulance, John sat with his elbows on his knees, fingers dug into his hair, the leather of his watchband pressed white against his skin. "Please," he breathed, so quietly he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to the doctor, the paramedic, the sky outside the small window, or to a God he claimed not to believe in. "Please." Mary, riding in the front seat by the paramedic, folded her hands, but she didn't bow her head. She had learned long ago that prayer fits into any posture. The point is the heart, not the position. Be with her, be with him, bring breath, bring calm, bring light. Hospital corridors have a way of stripping a person down to their essence. Titles don't fit through those doors. Wealth doesn't get priority seating beside suffering. John stood at the nurse's station, signing forms with hands that were steady only because they had been trained to be, and then he waited, time stretching and contracting. Around the rise and fall of a small chest, in a room with too much light and not enough certainty. When the pediatric critical care doctor finally stepped in, a woman with clear eyes and a voice that didn't waste words, John felt both relief and panic. "We're stabilizing her," she said. "We've started antibiotics, oxygen support, and fluids. The next hours matter. She's a fighter." "Can I stay?" John asked, and he hated how the question sounded, like he was asking permission to love his own child. Properly. "You're her father," the doctor said simply. "Be here. Talk to her. Love helps too." Love helps too. The phrase felt like a quiet indictment of the way John had defined help his entire life. He sat by the bed, speaking about ordinary things, about the bay window at home, about the way the maple trees would be red soon, about the dog they didn't have, but maybe could think about now. "We could name him Scout," he murmured, brushing a curl from Emily's forehead. "Or Pumpkin. We can decide. Together. You tell me." Emily stirred, eyelids fluttering. "Pumpkin," she whispered, the syllables thin but unmistakable. John laughed through tears he couldn't hide. "Pumpkin it is." Behind the scenes, Mary watched a different kind of transformation begin. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. Pride, when confronted with fragility, recalibrates or it breaks. She had seen it before in other families, other rooms. The journey could be long or sudden, but it often started with the same revelation. Control is a useful tool and a terrible god. She didn't preach it. She just held the space, warmed by the quiet freedom of knowing that love and prayer work at levels even medicine acknowledges but can't graph on a chart. "You're still praying?" John said later, not accusing, just noticing, as if narrating something he couldn't help but see. Mary nodded. "Always." He stared at the monitor, the green lines tracing a rhythm he would have traded his entire portfolio to guarantee. "I don't understand it," he confessed. "It feels like doing nothing, and yet I can't—" He stopped, swallowing the rest. "I can't fix this." "You're doing what only you can do," Mary said. "You're being her father. The rest, let the doctors work, and let me pray." He didn't answer, but the silence wasn't the old silence filled with contempt. It was a new one, packed with decisions forming beneath the surface, decisions about presence, about priorities, about what counts when the columns of profit and loss get replaced by breath and heartbeat. Evening settled outside the hospital windows, New York's lights waking up like a field of stars. In Emily's room, machines hummed a mechanical lullaby, while Mary's lips moved with a prayer that had no edges and needed no translation. John sat with his daughter, eyes fixed on her face, as if memorizing every line. In that posture, the hidden truth rose like a tide he couldn't push back. Wealth buys many things, but it cannot purchase mercy, it cannot lease. And time, it cannot sign a contract with breath. Emily's fingers twitched in his hand, and he bent close. "I'm right here," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." The night didn't promise ease. It didn't promise answers, but it drew a circle around them. The father learning to wait, the maid refusing to stop praying, the child somewhere between fever and rest. And inside that circle, something essential was shifting, preparing the ground for what would be asked of them next. The night in the hospital stretched on like a thread that refused to break. Machines hummed steadily, their blinking lights casting faint shadows across the walls. Emily lay in the bed, her small chest rising and falling in uneven rhythms that pulled at every nerve in John's body. He sat rigidly in the chair beside her, gripping her hand with both of his, whispering promises he wasn't sure she could hear. "You're going to be okay, sweetheart. Daddy's right here. I'm not letting go." His voice cracked, a sound so foreign to him that it startled even himself. Mary stood at the edge of the room, her hands folded, watching silently. She had seen sickness before. She had cared for her mother through long nights, watched neighbors fight to breathe when medicine came too late. But this moment felt heavier, different. Emily's fever had spiked again, and her body trembled under the weight of it. The doctors had done everything they could for now, and the air in the room was thick with waiting. It was the kind of waiting that stripped away all illusions of control. John paced once, twice, then stopped, his fists pressed against his temples. Why isn't she getting better? Why isn't anything working? His words weren't directed at anyone, but the helplessness behind them was loud enough to fill the room. He was a man who had built empires on quick decisions and iron will, yet here he was, utterly powerless, unable to outnegotiate an illness that didn't care who he was or how much money he had. Mary's heart ached as she looked at Emily. Her lips parted, and before she could stop herself, the whisper she had kept hidden for days rose into words. She crossed to the far corner of the room, knelt down, and pressed her hands together. At first her voice was soft, trembling with the weight of the moment. "Heavenly Father, be with this child, bring her peace, bring her healing. Let her breath steady, let her body rest. Guide the hands of those who care for her, and give strength to her father." John turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as if her words had insulted the sterile order of the room. "Mary!" he barked, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the hum of the machines. "Not here, not now. I told you, no praying in front of me." His anger was less about her and more about the rising tide of his own fear. He needed something to lash out at, and her faith became the target. Mary didn't move. Her voice grew steadier, carrying more conviction with every word. "Lord, this child is yours. Before she is anyone's, you see what we cannot. You heal where we cannot reach." "Stop it!" John snapped, his fists clenching at his sides. He looked like a man caught between fury and collapse, his arrogance colliding with desperation. "Do you think words are going to fix this? Do you think whispers are stronger than medicine? This is ridiculous." Mary finally lifted her gaze to him, her eyes calm, almost defiant in their quiet certainty. "I think there are things beyond your reach, Mr. Peterson, and sometimes it's not medicine or money that makes the difference, it's what you can't see." Her tone wasn't confrontational. It was compassionate, steady, a voice that didn't ask for permission but spoke truth anyway. John froze, his chest heaving as he stared at her. He wanted to shout again, to tell her to leave, to reassert control over a situation slipping through his fingers. But then Emily let out a faint cough, her lips parting as her breathing shifted. Not perfect, but steadier than moments before. John's eyes darted to the monitor, the lines tracing a rhythm that was just slightly more even. He swallowed hard, the words he wanted to hurl catching in his throat. He didn't believe in prayer. He didn't want to. But in that fragile instant, he also didn't dare interrupt it. His desperation outweighed his pride. He dropped back into the chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in years, the armor he wore cracked visibly. His shoulders shook, not from anger, but from fear so raw it left no space for arrogance. "Please, Emily," he whispered into his palms. "Please don't leave me." Mary's voice filled the silence again, rising just enough to be heard over the steady hum of machines. "Lord, hear the cry of a father's heart. Teach him that love is stronger than pride, and let this child's life be the reminder of that truth." John lifted his head slowly, his eyes red. He looked at Mary for a long moment, wanting to dismiss her words, to silence her faith as he always had. But he couldn't. There was something in the way she prayed, not as a performance, not as a demand, but as if she were standing in the gap between life and death, holding Emily with more strength than his wealth ever could. His breath caught and he leaned back, closing his eyes. He didn't say it out loud, but the thought circled his mind like a revelation he couldn't shake. What if she's right? What if I've been blind this whole time? The night deepened, and the room seemed to hold its breath with them. Mary's prayer continued, a quiet stream of words weaving through the beeping monitors and the sterile smell of medicine. John's anger didn't return this time. It had been swallowed whole by something larger, something he didn't yet understand, but could no longer deny. And in that space between fury and surrender, between disbelief and desperation, the first fragile thread of transformation began to form, tying their lives together in a way that would change everything still to come. The hours that followed felt like an eternity suspended in a single room. The machines continued their ceaseless rhythm, numbers flickering on the monitors with a stubborn refusal to settle into certainty. John sat slumped in the chair beside his daughter's bed, his hand gripping Emily's as though his strength alone could anchor her to life. His mind was a storm, racing between memories of her first steps, her laughter in the garden, her quiet voice asking for One more story before bed. Each memory stabbed deeper into him, a cruel reminder that everything he had built, every deal, every skyscraper, every headline, meant nothing if he couldn't protect the one person who mattered most. And then, in the corner of the room, Mary's voice rose above the storm. She wasn't loud, but her words carried a clarity that filled the space, weaving around the machines, the fear, even John's anger. Lord, you hold her in your hands. You see her suffering. Breathe life into her body, calm into her spirit, and hope into this room. Her voice trembled slightly, but the conviction in it only grew stronger with each word. John wanted to shut it out. He wanted to reject the idea that faith, something invisible, could matter here in this sterile place of science and medicine. But as her prayer filled the silence, something shifted. Emily's chest, which had been rising and falling with a fragile unevenness, steadied almost imperceptibly. The jagged lines on the monitor began to smooth, the frantic beeps slowing into a more consistent pattern. John leaned forward, disbelief etched into his face. "Wait, what's happening?" His voice cracked, a mixture of fear and hope clashing inside him. Mary didn't stop praying. She pressed her palms together tighter, her words pouring out with a quiet urgency. "Thank you for hearing us. Thank you for bringing breath where there was none." Emily's small fingers twitched against John's palm, and he gasped, looking down, as if he had just witnessed something impossible. "Emily? Baby girl, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, only for a second, but it was enough. Enough to pierce through the darkness that had been closing in. At that moment, the door swung open, and Dr. Whitaker entered with a nurse, his expression brisk but tinged with surprise as he glanced at the monitor. He moved quickly to Emily's bedside, checking her pulse, adjusting the oxygen, examining her vitals. After a few tense minutes that felt like a lifetime, he straightened, his eyes wide in disbelief. "It's a miracle she's still breathing," he said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for both John and Mary to hear. "Her condition should have worsened. By all medical accounts, she shouldn't be stabilizing like this. And yet—" He trailed off, shaking his head as if logic had just betrayed him. John's breath caught in his chest. A miracle. The word echoed in his mind, colliding with years of disbelief, years of mocking faith as weakness. He turned his eyes slowly toward Mary, who remained on her knees, her head bowed, her lips still moving in prayer. For a long moment John couldn't speak. He wanted to deny it, to attribute Emily's sudden stability to medicine, to machines, to anything but what was unfolding before his eyes. But the timing was too sharp, too direct. His daughter's breath had steadied in the very moment Mary's voice had filled the room. The hidden truth was impossible to ignore, and it shook him more than any business collapse or market loss ever had. Finally, his voice broke through the silence, low and hoarse. "Mary, how did you know? How could you—" He stopped, unable to finish the question because it felt too dangerous to ask. Mary lifted her gaze, her eyes calm but filled with compassion. "I didn't know, Mr. Peterson. I only believed. Faith isn't about knowing every outcome. It's about trusting when you can't see." John sat back in his chair, his hands trembling, his mind spinning with revelations he wasn't ready to face. For the first time, he felt as though he was standing on a fault line, his entire mindset cracking beneath him. All the decisions he had made, the arrogance he had clung to, the control he believed was absolute. Suddenly, it all felt paper-thin. And here, in this sterile hospital room, a maid's prayer carried more impact than his fortune ever could. Dr. Whitaker cleared his throat, still baffled. "We'll keep monitoring her closely, but this kind of turnaround, it doesn't make sense medically. She's holding on, stronger than before. Somehow." His eyes flickered briefly toward Mary, though he said nothing more. Science had no room for faith in its vocabulary, yet even he couldn't explain what he had just witnessed. John leaned closer to Emily, brushing a curl from her damp forehead. His voice was barely a whisper, a confession more than a statement. "I almost lost you, and I couldn't do anything. Nothing." He swallowed hard, his eyes burning as he turned his gaze toward Mary again. But your faith, it changed something. Mary shook her head gently. It wasn't me. It was prayer. It was love greater than anything we hold in our hands. John lowered his eyes, his chest heavy with emotions he couldn't untangle. For the first time in his life, he felt small, not in defeat, but in awe. He had spent years chasing control, but now he realized the hidden truth. Some things are only found when you let go. The room settled into a strange calm. Emily's breathing was steadier, the machines less urgent, the storm easing ever so slightly. John sat there staring at his daughter, but also at the quiet strength kneeling in the corner. The maid he had mocked, the woman he had silenced, had just become the vessel of hope in his darkest hour. And though he didn't yet have the words for it, deep within him, something was shifting, a transformation that would not stop here, but would ripple through every decision, every revelation, every corner of his carefully built life. The journey was far from over, but in that fragile moment, he felt the first undeniable impact of faith colliding with his pride. And as the hospital lights flickered against the night sky, John remained by Emily's side, shaken but unable to look away from the truth that had been laid bare before him. Something had begun, and it would carry them forward into what neither of them could yet imagine. John had always been the figure who walked into a room and immediately owned it. In meetings, in courtrooms, in negotiations that carried millions of dollars in weight, he never flinched. His voice, his posture, his presence, it all spoke of a man unshakable, a man who believed the world bent to his will if he pressed hard enough. But now, in the sterile glow of the hospital room, surrounded by monitors and the faint scent of antiseptic, the illusion cracked. He sat hunched forward in the chair, his elbows pressed against his knees, his hands gripping the sides of his face as if to hold himself together. And for the first time in decades, John Peterson looked small. Emily lay in the bed, her breath shallow but steady, each rise and fall of her chest a fragile thread, keeping him tethered to hope. The steady hum of machines filled the silence, but beneath it was a weight heavier than silence itself. John's mind was a battlefield. Memories of boardroom victories clashed with the helplessness of this moment, and the outcome was clear. None of those past triumphs meant anything here. "All my money," he whispered, his voice breaking as the words slipped past his lips. His eyes burned and he pressed his fists against them, ashamed of the tears he could no longer control. "All my money, all my power, all these years of building," and nothing could help her. The sound of his confession wasn't loud, but it carried more impact than any speech he had ever delivered to his investors. Mary remained where she was, seated quietly near the corner. She didn't gloat. She didn't use his collapse as a chance to lecture or remind him of the arrogance he had carried. Instead, she watched with compassion, her eyes soft, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She had seen pride break before. She knew the journey from resistance to surrender was never easy, and she understood that John's unraveling wasn't weakness. It was revelation. John's voice cracked again as he turned toward her. "But your faith did," he said, his chest heaving. His eyes met hers, with a mixture of disbelief and awe. "You prayed, and she's still here. I don't understand it. I don't even want to understand it because it terrifies me. But it worked, and everything I had, everything I thought mattered, was worthless tonight." Mary shook her head gently, her voice steady. "It wasn't me, Mr. Peterson. It was never me. Faith is not magic. It's trust. It's surrender. It's letting go of the idea that we're in control when we never really were." Her words cut through him, slicing, deeper than any business rival's insult ever had. He leaned back in the chair, running his hand over his face, his breathing ragged. He had lived his entire life convinced that control was survival, that decisions and discipline were the only forces that shaped outcomes. Yet here, before his daughter's fragile body, he saw the hidden truth. Control was an illusion. "I thought I could buy my way out of anything," John muttered, his eyes unfocused, staring at the floor. "Every problem I ever faced, I just threw money at it until it went away. But this laughed at me. I've never felt so powerless, and I hate it." Mary leaned forward slightly, her tone soft but unwavering. "It's not about hating it, sir. It's about accepting it. Power has its place, money has its place, but there are things only love and faith can reach. You saw it tonight. You felt it." John's chest rose and fell as he tried to steady himself. He wasn't used to anyone speaking to him this way, not with challenge, but with truth spoken like a mirror he couldn't look away from. He wanted to argue, to dismiss her words as superstition, but he couldn't. Not after watching Emily's vitals settle in perfect harmony with the sound of Mary's prayer. His arrogance, once a fortress, had crumbled. He felt stripped bare, exposed, but also oddly relieved. For the first time, he wasn't carrying the crushing weight of having to solve everything. He had faced the hidden truth behind the curtain of his success. Money was powerful, yes, but not absolute. And in life's deepest battles, the ones fought in hospital rooms at 3 in the morning, the ones where no amount of wealth could buy breath or extend a heartbeat, he had no weapons. John's tears fell freely now, unchecked. He wasn't embarrassed, he wasn't posturing, he was simply a father, broken and raw, clinging to his daughter's hand. "I've lived like a fool," he whispered. "I thought I was untouchable, but tonight I'd give it all away. Every building, every contract, every dollar, if it meant she'd be okay." Mary closed her eyes briefly, whispering a prayer too soft for him to hear. When she opened them again, she offered a faint smile. "You don't have to give it all away, Mr. Peterson. But you do have to see it differently. Money can build houses, faith can make them homes, wealth can buy medicine. But love is what heals the soul." The words sank into him like water into dry soil. He didn't reply, but something in his eyes shifted. It was subtle, like the first hint of dawn after a long night. For a man who had always defined strength as dominance, there was transformation in simply sitting still, in admitting powerlessness. Behind the scenes of his collapse, another truth stirred. Emily's small body, though fragile, was fighting. The doctors spoke of antibiotics, of cautious optimism, of timelines and probabilities. But John no longer heard them as numbers on a chart. He heard them as chances for gratitude. Every breath she took was no longer a given, it was a gift. He sat back in the chair, his voice lower now, but steadier. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his gaze flicking between Emily and Mary. "I don't know how to believe in something I can't measure. I don't know how to surrender. It feels like weakness." Mary met his eyes. "It's not weakness, it's courage. The kind that changes everything. The kind that reshapes the way you see the world, the way you make decisions, the way you live your journey. Tonight you saw what pride hides, the truth that life is more than what we hold in our hands." John let the words wash over him. For the first time, he wasn't calculating, wasn't resisting. He simply sat with them, broken but listening. His heart cracked wide enough for something new to enter. The man who had built skyscrapers with his ambition now sat quietly in a hospital room, humbled by the unseen power of prayer and love. The mansion, the business, the empire, they all seemed distant now, shadows of a life that felt suddenly shallow compared to the weight of this moment. And as John's head lowered once more, his hand holding Emily's small fingers like the most precious contract he had ever signed, he knew something within him had shifted forever. The night stretched on, the monitors steadying with quiet persistence, and John remained there, stripped of arrogance, no longer the unshakable giant, but a father learning the fragile, powerful truth about what really matters. And though he couldn't yet see the road ahead, he had already stepped onto it, carrying with him the cracks of pride that would soon give way to something entirely new. Morning arrived like a soft verdict, neither harsh nor triumphant, just honest. The hospital room felt different in daylight, less like a battlefield, more like a recovery ward where the air learned to breathe again. Emily slept, her small hand limp in her father's palm, and for the first time in 30 hours, John watched her without flinching. He still felt the tremor in his chest, the aftershock of watching his certainty collapse, but there was something else now too, an awareness he couldn't file under profit or loss. It was as if a curtain had been drawn back and he could finally see the behind-the-scenes mechanics of his own heart. The mindset that had kept him armored, the decisions that had made him efficient but distant, the hidden truth that he had mistaken control for love. He didn't resent the revelation. He held it, turning it over like a fragile stone, rediscovered on a shoreline he thought he knew. Mary stood by the window, not hovering, not retreating, simply present. She had a way of taking up space that didn't push others out. When John lifted his eyes to her, it wasn't the look of a man evaluating an employee. It was something more human, more level. He stood, rubbed the fatigue from his face, and walked to where she stood. "I owe you more than I know how to say," he began, voice rough with a humility that surprised even him. "And before anything else, I need to say I'm sorry," he swallowed, searching for words that wouldn't sound rehearsed. "I was cruel to you. I mocked the one thing that gave you strength. I tried to control a house that didn't even have peace inside it. I thought power was proof of worth, and I made you feel small to keep that illusion alive. I'm ashamed of that." He didn't look away. "Mary, I'm sorry." Mary's eyes softened, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet recognition. "Thank you," she said. "You don't owe me poetry, Mr. Peterson. Truth is enough, and I accept your apology." She paused and nodded toward Emily's bed. "She's stronger today. That matters most." He exhaled, a long breath that sounded like a gate unlatched. "It does, but there's more I need to change." He glanced at the sleeping child and the monitors that now hummed like background singers rather than soloists. "When we go home, I want that house to feel different, not just polished, not just efficient, different." His voice steadied. "You prayed in a corner as if your faith had to hide. It won't hide in my home anymore. I won't ask it to. I won't ask you to." The words landed with simple weight. Mary didn't smile broadly. She understood that transformation isn't a fireworks display. It's a series of lived decisions that become character. "Then we'll build peace in small ways," she said, "table by table, day by day." Emily stirred, eyelids fluttering open like the quietest. "Sunrise. Daddy." The word threaded the room with light. He was beside her in a heartbeat, brushing her hair back with a tenderness that felt new because it wasn't rushed. "I'm here, Pumpkin," he said, and then laughed because the name had stuck. "I'm right here." She blinked, noticing Mary. "You stayed." "I did," Mary whispered, "and I'll keep staying." The pediatric doctor entered and spoke of progress, of labs turning from worrisome to watchful, of an expected discharge if the next tests held. "Steady." John nodded, absorbing the clinical clarity with gratitude instead of entitlement. He thanked the team without performance. He thanked Mary without ceremony. Gratitude, he was learning, is most honest when it's unadorned. When they returned to Westchester days later, the mansion didn't shrink in scale, but it did shift in atmosphere. The staff moved more gently, as if they too sensed the recalibration. Emily padded through the foyer in socks, pressing her palm to the cool banister like greeting an old friend. She asked if she could sit in the kitchen with Mary while she finished her tea, and John didn't correct her. He followed, leaning against the doorframe, watching a room he had only passed through now become the center of gravity. At dinner, he did something he hadn't done since before he was a widow. He turned off his phone and left it in the study. The long table felt cavernous with 3 chairs, but it was no longer a stage. It was a place. Mary brought a simple meal, roasted chicken, carrots, bread, nothing that would make a magazine layout, everything that builds real strength. Before they lifted their forks, the moment arrived without fanfare, the kind that doesn't announce itself and so ends up meaning more. John cleared his throat, unsure how to bridge decades of habit in a single sentence. "Mary," he said, We're grateful you're here. I'm grateful." He looked at Emily, then back to Mary. Would you Would you lead us in grace?" The room held its breath, not from disbelief, but from the impact of symbolic reversal. The maid he had once silenced was now being asked to speak first. Mary nodded with a stillness that never confused humility with hesitation. She folded her hands, and Emily mirrored her instinctively. John followed, awkward at first, not out of show, but out of effort, like a man learning to write with his other hand. Mary's voice was steady, for food, for breath, for healing still in progress, for the journey behind us and the one ahead, for a home learning peace from the inside out. Amen. Amen, Emily said, clear as a bell. John's amen sat lower, seasoned with the honesty of a man who didn't pretend to be further along than he was. Throughout the meal, conversation didn't move like a performance. It wandered like a river that knew where it was going. Emily told them how the hospital fish tank had 2 orange fish that always swam together like best friends on a field trip. Mary mentioned the neighbors' garden tulips sprouting early. John listened more than he spoke, feeling the odd relief of not having to direct the flow. Leadership at the table, he realized, was mostly attention. In the days that followed, the shift deepened in practice. John rearranged his mornings, not by posting a memo, but by showing up differently. He walked with Emily to the end of the driveway before school, making a pocket of time that had never existed because he had never made it. He paused in the kitchen to ask Mary what she needed, rather than telling her what he wanted. He apologized quickly when he slipped into old patterns, because revelations are the easy part and repetition is the real work. He didn't try to package his change for public relations. This wasn't a press release. It was repentance turned into routine. Behind the scenes, there were quiet decisions with quiet impact. He restored Sunday dinners to the calendar, not as an obligation, but as a practice. He asked Mary to sit at the table, instead of hovering at the edges, and when she hesitated, trained by years of being asked to disappear, he pulled out the chair himself, not as a performance for Emily, but for truth. "Please," he said, and meant it. The first time she sat, the house felt like it exhaled. Emily beamed as if some geometry had finally aligned. "Mary, you have to try the bread with honey," she said, placing a small plate in front of her, as if knighting a hero with the tools of ordinary joy. Word of the change didn't spread through John's investors or the press. It spread quietly through the household, through the way the doorman noticed John's softened tone, through the way the housekeeper saw him carry his own dishes to the sink, through the way the chauffeur watched him buckle Emily in himself. They were small gestures, but small doesn't mean insignificant. The journey from arrogance to humility isn't a leap. It's a liturgy of small, aligned acts. One evening, a week after they'd returned from the hospital, John walked into the library and paused at the bay window where Emily liked to sit with her books. She was there, legs tucked under her, a blanket around her shoulders. On the low table sat a worn children's Bible Mary had lent her, open to a page with penciled stars in the margins. Emily didn't hide it the way she once might have. She looked up, unafraid. "Dad, Mary says the stories don't work like magic tricks. They're like maps for the heart." He lowered himself onto the window seat. Beside her, careful of the rhythm they were building. "Maps for the heart," he repeated, testing the shape of the phrase. "I could use one of those." "You have one," Emily said, pointing to his chest as if describing the simplest fact. "It got louder at the hospital." He put an arm around her shoulders. "It did," he admitted, "and I'm trying to listen." Later that night, before dinner, he found Mary in the pantry making notes on a grocery list. He didn't hover at the threshold the way he once would have, managerial and distant. He stepped in, palms open. "Mary," he said, "can I ask you something that I would have mocked a month ago?" She waited. "Will you keep praying in our home? Not in corners, not in whispers. At the table, in the living room. Wherever peace belongs, I want Emily to grow up in a house where faith doesn't have to hide." His voice steadied. "And I don't want to hide from it either." She held his gaze for a long moment, not to test him, but to honor the weight of what he was asking. Then we'll keep praying, she said, simple and unadorned, and we'll keep loving. That's how houses become homes. He nodded. I'm learning that. A few nights later, he invited 2 close friends to dinner, men who were used to seeing him stride into high-ceilinged rooms and dominate conversations about trendlines and mergers. They arrived with their usual rhythms, ready for the familiar theatre of success. But the stage had changed set pieces. They found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, setting plates, asking Mary whether the roast needed 5 more minutes or 10. There was no performance, only coordination. When they sat, John did not launch into market talk. He cleared his throat, glanced at Mary, and nodded. She bowed her head, and the room followed. For food and friendship, she began, for breath and the mercy of ordinary days, for the hidden truth that strength is given, not seized. Amen. The guests lifted their heads and looked around, disoriented by the reordering they couldn't name. John didn't explain it. He didn't need to. The explanation was the atmosphere itself. After the meal, one of the men pulled John aside. "You okay?" he asked, half concerned, half skeptical. "I'm better than okay," John said, surprising himself with how true it felt. "I'm learning how to be a father at the table, not just a provider on paper." He gestured toward Mary and Emily, now laughing at the sink, sleeves pushed up, bubbles climbing the edges of plates. "And I'm learning who taught me that." That night, after the house quieted and the dishes were put away, Emily asked for one more small grace. "Dad, can Mary read the bedtime prayer?" He glanced at Mary, then nodded with an ease that would have been impossible weeks earlier. They stood together in the doorway of Emily's room, while Mary read a simple blessing. No theatrics, no effort to impress, just a handful of sentences that settled across the room like a warm quilt. Words about rest, about courage, for tomorrow, about gratitude for the breath they had, the breath they'd been given back. When the light clicked off, John lingered in the hall, the corridor that once felt like a runway, now more like a gentle river, emptying toward a wider sea. He spoke softly, as if not to disturb the new geometry of the home. "Mary, I can't promise I won't stumble. People stumble," she said. "The important part is which way you're falling. You're falling forward." He smiled, not the polished one he used for photographs, but the unguarded kind that starts in the chest. "Then tomorrow we keep going." They did keep going. They added a short grace before Sunday breakfast. They built quiet rituals that didn't shout but shaped. John moved meetings to arrive at school concerts early. Emily's laughter returned to the staircase like a melody the house remembered by heart. And Mary's presence, once confined to the edges, now anchored the center with the sort of authority that doesn't need a title, the authority of a life aligned. On a rain-soft evening, as thunder rolled somewhere far off and the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and apples, Mary stepped out onto the back patio for a breath of cool air. John joined her, hands in his pockets, eyes on the wet lawn glowing under the porch lights. "There's something I haven't said," he murmured. "When I lost my wife, I built a fortress. I thought that if I kept everything tightly controlled, nothing could hurt Emily again. Nothing could hurt me." He hesitated, then let the confession find its landing. "But control didn't protect us. It just made the house quiet." Mary listened without trying to solve the ache. "Fortresses keep out more than danger," she said. "They keep out what heals." He nodded. "I see that now, and I want the gates open." He looked back toward the window where Emily's silhouette danced by the table. "I want a home that knows how to say grace and mean it." Inside, the oven timer chimed. Emily called out, "It's ready." Her voice cut through the rain like a ribbon of light. John took a step toward the door, then paused and looked at Mary, the woman who had once knelt in a corner to pray and was now asked to stand at the head of the table. "Will you lead us again?" he asked, not as a man making up for past errors, but as a father making a present choice. Mary nodded, and they went in together, the sound of plates and soft thunder weaving a familiar cadence. The table waited, simple and real, and as they gathered, The house leaned subtly in, learning, breath by breath, to hold a different kind of power. The evening opened like a page. You turn carefully when you finally understand the story matters. And somewhere in that quiet procession, from oven to table, from apology to practice, the next step was already taking shape, ready to be lived. In the weeks that followed, the Peterson mansion looked the same from the outside. The gates still opened with mechanical precision, the marble floors still reflected. The chandeliers and the cars in the driveway still gleamed as if they had never touched the dust of ordinary streets. Yet anyone who stepped inside could sense something different. It wasn't louder, it wasn't grander. In fact, it was quieter, but with a quiet that breathed rather than suffocated. The atmosphere had shifted, as though invisible walls had come down, making space for something far stronger than appearances. John noticed it most in the little things. He noticed it when Emily's laughter rang through the halls and didn't feel out of place. He noticed it when Mary hummed softly while setting the table and didn't look over her shoulder as if waiting for him to interrupt. And he noticed it in himself, in the way he no longer felt the need to fill silence with orders or cover vulnerability with pride. Transformation had not been a grand performance. It had been a series of small decisions, repeated until they built something new. Late one evening, John found himself sitting, alone in the study, the very room where he had once rehearsed his control over the world. The desk was still piled with contracts and market reports, but he wasn't looking at them. Instead, he stared at a single photograph. Emily smiling in the hospital bed, Mary seated beside her, both of them looking at him as though the three of them shared a truth no one else could see. He touched the frame, his voice a quiet confession to the empty room. It wasn't me, I couldn't do it, but she did. She prayed when I wouldn't. She believed when I couldn't. He paused, his throat tight. And somehow, that saved us. The lesson was impossible to miss. For years, John had dismissed faith as weakness, humility as irrelevance, prayer as superstition. Yet in the moment when his empire collapsed into meaninglessness, it was the very thing he mocked that carried him through. Behind the scenes of his wealth and power, the real source of strength had been kneeling quietly in his own home all along. The hidden truth of that night in the hospital lingered, shaping the way he saw every interaction after. When he looked at Mary now, he didn't see a maid. He saw a woman whose quiet conviction had saved his daughter's life, a woman whose strength had never depended on status or wealth. And when he looked at Emily, he didn't just see his child, he saw a living reminder that life's most precious things are not bought, but received, held, and cherished. In a mansion filled with wealth, the narrator's voice reflects, it wasn't money that saved a child's life, it was faith. And sometimes the very things we dismiss as weakness become the strength that carries us through. John carried those words with him, even if he never spoke them aloud. Humility had once felt foreign, like a garment that didn't fit. Now it felt like the only clothing worth wearing. Respect had once been something he demanded from others. Now it was something he offered freely, knowing its weight was far greater when given than when seized. And faith, the word he had mocked, the act he had forbidden, became the quiet current running beneath his home, unseen but undeniable, as real as the breath he once feared he would lose. The story was never about grand displays of power or riches that dazzled the eye. It was about the unseen, the behind-the-scenes forces that shape us when we least expect it. It was about the mindset shift that comes when arrogance collapses and leaves space for gratitude. It was about the journey of a man who thought he had everything, only to discover he had nothing without the very things he once dismissed. Mary remained the same in many ways, humble, grounded, faithful. Yet her role had transformed. No longer hidden in the corners, she now stood openly in the center of the Peterson home, leading grace at the table, offering prayers without fear, living proof that the unseen power of faith can turn even the coldest mansion into a home filled with warmth. And as the days stretched into months, one truth remained constant. The wealth of the Peterson family no longer lay in contracts, estates, or investments. Their wealth was in the humility learned, the respect earned, and the faith embraced. The kind of wealth that cannot be measured in numbers, but in the impact it leaves behind. The camera lingers on the family at the dinner table. John with his hands loosely folded, Emily giggling as she tries to mimic Mary's words. Mary smiling with the patience of someone who knows real strength doesn't need to shout. The house around them gleams the same as before, but what fills it now is entirely different. It is not the echo of arrogance, but the sound of love, humility, and a quiet faith that had once been silenced but now speaks freely. The journey hasn't ended, it has only begun, because true transformation is not a single event, but a way of living. One decision, one prayer, one act of humility at a time, and that, more than wealth or power, is what shapes the legacy of a life. And if you've stayed with me until this point, you already know this story wasn't just about a mansion or a family. It was about something deeper, something we all carry inside us. If this message spoke to you in any way, let me know in the comments with a simple phrase like, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end." I always love reading your reflections, and they remind me how connected we really are through these stories. If you found value here, don't forget to leave a like. It helps keep these messages alive and reaching more people who might need them at just the right moment. And if you want to keep walking through stories like this with me, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There's another video waiting for you right here that ties beautifully with this one. Click and continue with me there. You'll see how the journey carries on in ways you might not expect.